It's all about real-life pairs whose work together changed the world.
They represent humanity's greatest ambition. It's beyond a dynamic duo.
What they were able to accomplish is unprecedented.
We're going to rank the top 10 dynamic duos with the help of 100 experts. They use stats, innovation, and legacy to find the team with the best record. From sports,
Venus and Serena have 9 Olympic medals.
to music,
Well, it's not the Beatles, it's Paul McCartney and John Lennon together as a duo.
to building business empires.
Athletic footwear was no longer relegated to athletics, and none of it would be possible without Bill Bowerman and Phil Knight.
For these double acts, there's no me in team.
It's not a popularity contest. It's who's greatest. Deal with it.
Which pair do you think will rise to the top? Only one way to find out. Let the countdown begin.
Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were at the vanguard of human achievement. It's beyond a dynamic duo.
Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, oh my gosh. You know, the first two to walk on the moon.
I feel like strapping yourself into a tin can to risk your life to push humanity forward is probably worth a pretty high ranking on this list.
It's just an example to billions of people all over the world. This is what we are capable of when we work together, when we apply ourselves, when we are disciplined, and when we work as a team.
After the Soviets put a human in space in 1961, President Kennedy promises to put a man on the moon. 8 years later, 2 men make it there, Neil and Buzz.
Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were not just pioneers, they were ace pilots, they were engineers.
They worked very well together, but there wasn't a lot of friendly camaraderie. They were very much mission-driven.
Buzz did his PhD research on lunar rendezvous at MIT, and the right guy to be there with Neil to feed him the information and to make that landing successful.
It was probably the highest pressure, the highest profile job that any two individuals could do. It was also fraught with potential peril. If there is a hardware failure on the surface of the moon, most likely Armstrong and Aldrin are not coming back.
15 seconds.
We know how many astronauts have died. Those who have risked their lives for the benefit of exploration and discovery.
It's almost hard to quantify how huge that was, I think, both from a political perspective and also just from a pop culture perspective. It was truly a world-changing moment.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This wasn't just a victory for the United States. This was a victory for all mankind.
Our duo got most of the attention, but we can't forget the third astronaut, Michael Collins, who orbits around the moon solo while Neil and Buzz are on the surface bounding around.
I can't really say anything against this dynamic duo being GOATs. However, there were 3 of them on that mission. If you want to make a list of dynamic trios.
Actually, there were hundreds of thousands of people contributing in different engineering and operational science jobs to make all this happen. But when we look up at the moon or we think about the moon landings, we identified with Neil and Buzz.
Beatlemania takes the country by storm.
Well, it's not the Beatles, it's Paul McCartney and John Lennon together as a duo.
Lennon and McCartney, the most important dynamic duo, the number one, to my mind.
I mean, they are absolute GOATs. These two just gave so many gifts to the world through their music. Unbelievable.
That creative dynamic between Lennon and McCartney, it was just natural. It flowed from them as if they really were blood brothers.
There were 4 members of the Beatles, so I'm not exactly sure this fits into the dynamic duo category.
People talk about the Beatles as 4 members of the band, and Ringo was the best drummer. Or look at George Harrison's body of work. A lot of those songs were songs that were workshopped by McCartney and Lennon. So I'm not sure that the other two guys really count.
If you're still talking about people 2 generations later and one of them is dead, that's the test. People still play their music today.
Paul and John got together very early. They were kids. They were 15 and 16 years old. They had this process of growing up together, both musically and what you had to do to deal with this sudden fame that came upon you.
He was such a major talent, John, and such a great fella. But I miss him particularly on the songwriting. I'd have a hard time finding anyone that good, wouldn't I?
Paul McCartney and John Lennon were competitive. They were constantly writing songs to outdo the other. That's a big part of Lennon-McCartney's success as a duo.
Lennon and McCartney made an agreement somewhere along the line that they would sign their songs, Lennon and McCartney.
McCartney pulled the genius out of John, and John gave McCartney an edge that he desperately needed.
The Beatles become a smashing success in Great Britain. By 1964, it's time to cross the pond and test their luck in the United States. They debut on one of the top TV shows of the time, The Ed Sullivan Show.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles.
You have Ed Sullivan, and you had the recordings out on the radio, and then you had A Hard Day's Night out a few months later. So this was like a multimedia assault.
The teenager became an economic force in the 1960s in ways that no one ever thought about him. Lennon and McCartney were foundational to that.
They were being played nonstop on every radio station. The result was unprecedented domination of the U.S. charts, where they had at one point like 5 top 10 singles at the same time. Even Elvis didn't do that right off the bat.
There was Rubber Soul at the end of '65, Revolver in the summer of '66, and then Sgt. Pepper's in '67. Those 3 albums came at a time when like rock and roll was exploding, but they really had no peers. They were inventing as they went along.
They'd come into the studio in the morning, and Ringo and George would have coffee, and Paul would go over to the piano and write 8 songs before anybody else finished the donut, you know, and John would come in and add something to it. The group moved because of McCartney and Lennon.
They were such a dynamic duo, giving, taking, and occasionally putting the other down to get that edge.
The Beatles disband in 1970, but that doesn't impact their popularity or their record sales.
In 2019, the Beatles brought in $67 million in royalties. $2 billion would be the worth of their songwriting catalog, probably the highest valuation of any songwriter's body of work that there is. So if you want the statistics that's going to win the bar argument, yeah, there you go, I think.
The fact that these two guys were able to come together is, I think, one of those magical moments in human history that almost never happens.
Just to start a fight, I don't think anything Paul McCartney did after McCartney-Lennon was as impactful, as significant as the Lennon-McCartney pairing. And so we should never underestimate the value of collaboration.
We're getting ready to crown our top pair of all time. A duo who beat some tough competition. But there's no doubt about it. Our winning pair are high flyers. Coming in at number 1, it's the Wright brothers.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Wright brothers are solid GOAT status.
Oh my gosh. Wright brothers as a dynamic duo, put them up there. Get them as high as you can.
You can't beat the Wright brothers, right? We all fly. I mean, how do you beat flight? You can't beat flight.
I mean, they're no Lennon and McCartney. What Lennon and McCartney did, it's bigger than the airplane.
You can't tell me that aviation, in terms of its impact on warfare, its impact on trade, on the very fact that it ferries musicians like Lennon and McCartney around, doesn't surpass all these other dynamic duos.
The Wright brothers risked their lives, really, trying to advance aviation. Those early planes were pretty rickety. Yeah, I'll give them number 1 on this list.
We could not fathom our world without planes. No one's done this successfully before the Wright brothers.
I read op-eds and newspaper articles written around the year 1900 criticizing those who were trying to fly, saying it'll never work. It was a critique of efforts of brilliant, innovative people, a critique asserting that they have better things to do than trying to fly.
Little did these reporters know, a pair of brothers in Ohio think differently and begin trying to prove the naysayers wrong.
Wilbur and Orville Wright were 2 brothers who grew up in a very interesting household for their time.
They were deeply independent thinkers. Their father really instilled in them self-belief, self-determination, independent thought, and perseverance.
Before the Wright brothers began building airplanes, they actually run a bicycle design and repair shop.
What they learned building bicycles, they took directly and applied to building airplanes. And in fact, all of the gliders and the planes were built in their bicycle shop.
The Wright brothers always had this fascination with aeronautics. They literally observed the way birds would take flight, and they tried to create a craft that could mimic that. They added an element of flex to each of the wings so that they could turn right and left. They added a rudder on the back to give a little bit more control, and the ability to flex the wings upwards and down would give them the ability to climb and to dive.
People have died in gliders over the course of hundreds of years in an attempt to do this very sort of thing.
They actually managed to create the first power-driven, heavier-than-air aircraft flight. And in 59 seconds, one of the Wright brothers managed to fly 852 feet.
This incredible moment at which our bipedal earthbound species broke away and became a part of flight. I mean, it's astonishing.
It's a new era in transit transport really was ushered in. And if that alone doesn't make them the most dynamic duo, I don't know what is.
In a real small time span, we went from 2 brothers with a bike shop to jumbo jets. I think without the 2 of them pushing each other, believing in what they were trying to do, Kitty Hawk doesn't happen, Delta doesn't happen. Wow, what a dynamic duo.
Just try counting the stats on this pair.
Every second somewhere on this planet, an airplane is taken off someplace. And it shrunk the world. Also led to space travel.
If you've ever gotten on a plane to go on vacation, or even looked up at the sky and seen the jet trails, you're basically looking at the legacy of the Wright brothers.
The Wright brothers creating the ability of humans to take flight and traverse massive distances in a short amount of time safely, it is a modern miracle.